Well, as I record this, over 24 million people have had their first dose of a coronavirus vaccine here in the UK. Last Friday, there have just been 48 recorded deaths that occurred within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. That's the lowest figure since September last year. There are currently just under 8,000 people in hospital because of COVID-19. That's a fifth of the peak figure that we had in the middle of January. There are 4 variants of concern currently being tracked by Public Health England, and there's a further 5 variants that are under investigation. I don't think there's ever been a point in my lifetime where information like this has so filled our news cycles and occupied our minds. And why is that? Well, because as the government keeps saying, the way out of lockdown is going to be driven by data and not by dates. More than ever, we're aware of the information that governs our lives, and we so crave the stats that we find ourselves tuning in to watch the Downing Street press conferences, and we celebrate those who present them. Who would have guessed this time last year that there would be 245 buying options for a Chris Whitty mug on Etsy? Just spare a thought for poor old Jonathan Van Tam. If he wants to drink from a mug with his face on it, he's only got 29 to choose from. Well, of course, our thirst for knowledge and wisdom, it isn't just confined to the coronavirus statistics. It's the reason we value the advice of old friends, or why we get sent on CPD courses at work. It's why the Instagrammers have their influence and why we read the blog posts that our friends share on Facebook. It's why the agony aunts and advice columns appear in our newspapers and magazines. Why so many new parents take to Mumsnet when their child won't sleep or won't eat or won't stop crying. If I just knew more, we think, if only I had a bit more wisdom, well then everything would be okay. We think like that, and that's why we're asking this question today. Can knowing more really save us? Can it bear the weight that we put on it? And to answer that question, we're going to turn to a book of the Bible called Ecclesiastes, which is the collected wisdom of an enigmatic character called the Teacher. And although it was written down some 3,000 years ago, the Teacher's wisdom is remarkably contemporary. As you read through it, it's like he's describing the world in which we live, which is why we're turning to this ancient wisdom, because maybe it has what we need to help us navigate our very modern pandemic. The Teacher was a man with an inquisitive mind. He wasn't afraid to ask the difficult questions, and among other things, he wanted to know if knowledge had any limits. And so he set out on a search. And here's the first thing he has to tell us. He says, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. The Teacher turns to wisdom. Why? Because it helps him to understand all that is done under the heavens. You see, in the Teacher's mind, it's clear knowledge is a blessing. And so we're not stupid to want more of it. So a bit later on, he writes this. He says, I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. Do you see what the Teacher is saying? Wisdom is good because it's better than folly. Living a wise life is better than living a foolish life. Living a wise life, it's like walking around in the light, alert to the things that are all around you. Whereas living a foolish life, well, that's like walking around in the dark, completely unaware of your surroundings. Living a wise life is just better than the alternative, says the Teacher. Wisdom, knowledge, information, data, it's a good thing. Something to be thankful for. It's just that we're not to expect too much of it. Because as the teacher discovered, knowledge cannot satisfy. As he reflected on his search for knowledge, he exclaimed this: "What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind." The longer he spent looking for answers, the harder he tried to understand life, the more burdened he became. Knowledge is good, and yet the more the teacher knew, the more frustrated he became with life. And so he concluded this: "I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind." The teacher says that trying to get satisfaction from wisdom and knowledge is like chasing after the wind. It's meaningless, it's elusive. When I get out for my daily exercise, I'm often going up and down the Thames path, and last week it was really quite windy, and so a number of people had their coffee cups swept out of their hands by the breeze, and I must admit I quite enjoyed watching them doing that funny stamp dance you try and do as you chase after your cup, trying to stop it going into the river. Trying to grab a piece of rubbish that's being blown away, that is hard enough, and you can physically get it. Well, the teacher says that trying to get satisfaction from wisdom, it's like chasing after the wind. Much more evasive than those coffee cups. It slips through your fingers with ease. Satisfaction from knowledge is so elusive. But why? Why does the teacher think that? Well, he gives us two reasons, and here's the first. No matter how much we understand, the teacher tells us that what is crooked cannot be straightened. He says there are things that wisdom cannot fix, things in this world that knowledge cannot change. And some of these things will be trivial, but they're frustrating, like why does it always rain when you forget your umbrella? Or why is the queue that you join in the supermarket the slowest, even though it's the shortest? Some are trivial but frustrating, others are significant and heartbreaking. Why has she lost her job in lockdown? Why has he died from COVID? Why can't they have children? And then to make things even worse, not only can knowledge not change some things, some questions knowledge cannot even answer. The teacher goes on to say that what is lacking cannot be counted. He says life doesn't add up. There are things missing that we don't even know about. You see, no matter how much wisdom and knowledge we have, the teacher says that living in this world is like trying to do a jigsaw puzzle where an unknown number of pieces are missing. Wisdom is good, says the teacher, and yet it cannot satisfy because there are things it cannot change. Then he gives us another reason why wisdom cannot satisfy, and it's this: it exposes us to sorrows. Here's how he puts it: with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. The saying tells us, doesn't it, that ignorance is bliss. Well, I don't think any of us really believe that, and I'm certainly not saying it's true. But the teacher says that wisdom isn't much better. Because as we understand the world in which we live, as we see more of the frustrations of life, and we see the brokenness of it all, the more we know, the more sorrows we have. After all, whose heart is really cheered by knowing that 516 people have died in the UK within 28 days of a positive COVID test? Or that in the previous lockdown, calls to police about domestic violence in London went up by 12%. Knowing these things, it is good. It does help us to take appropriate action, for example. but it doesn't lead to satisfaction. It leads to sorrow. Wisdom is good. The teacher would want us to know that. It can help us to understand the world. But it can't satisfy because there are things it cannot change, and because it exposes us to sorrow. Well, we'll get to some good news in just a moment, but first the teacher has some more home truths about wisdom that he wants to expose. Because he wants us to know this, that living a wise life is ultimately pointless. And why is that? Well, although it's true that the wise have eyes in their head while the fools walk in darkness, although it's true that it's better to live a wise life than a foolish one, the teacher came to realise that the same fate overtakes them both. There's no point being wise, said the teacher. After all, where does your wisdom get you? Exactly the same place as the fool. It takes you to the grave. He goes on, for the wise, like the fool, will not long be remembered. The days have already come where both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise must die. Wisdom, you see, it's limited in life and defeated by death. At the end of the day, being wise makes no difference at all. And so if wisdom is going to make a real difference in our lives, we need something better than the wisdom that teacher discovered. We need a wisdom that can deal with death, a wisdom that leads to joy and not sorrow, a wisdom that can make a difference in our lives. It turns out that what we need is what one of the New Testament writers, the Apostle Paul, talked about in a letter to a church in the Greek city of Corinth in the 1st century AD. Let me read some of what he wrote for us. He said this, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God." Paul says we need the wisdom of the cross. And you may well be thinking, I'm not so sure about that because, well, the cross seems like utter foolishness. Where is the wisdom in dying such a humiliating and torturous death? That doesn't seem like a wise thing for anyone to do. But actually, God's wisdom is not like our human wisdom. Because what seems ridiculous to us is actually God's wisdom for us. Because the cross is the way that God has chosen to put his world right. Jesus' death is the death that defeated all death, the one that can overcome the grave. And so that means the wisdom of the cross is the wisdom that will ultimately lead to joy and not to sorrow, because it will take us to a place where death has been defeated. A wisdom that deals with death, and so therefore a wisdom that promises joy and not sorrow. But I wonder if you noticed, the cross isn't just God's wisdom. No, Paul also described it as God's power as well. And it's God's power, among other things, to transform us. His power to straighten up that which is crooked in our lives, to make a real difference day to day for you and for me. A wisdom that defeats death, a wisdom that promises joy and not sorrow, a wisdom that can make a difference. I don't know about you, but that is the sort of wisdom that I want in my life. And could it be the sort of wisdom that could really save us?